Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce to you, maybe not introduce, but at least discuss the amazing lymphatic system. Yeah, that's right. We have a system in our body that is, I will say, very similar to the cardiovascular system. As you can see here, I drew I'd say a kind of a primitive drawing of the cardiovascular system here. And the lymphatic system is a sort of a parallel system, kind of like, if I can use an analogy, if the circulatory system was the roads in a city, the lymphatic system would be sort of like the sewer pipes that are below the road. So we have this system in our body of vessels that are sort of parallel the circulatory system, and they do an amazing job, and that is to return fluid to the blood and help in defense. And so that may seem abstract, but that's the point of the video. So let's jump right into this conversation, because I hope it's going to be good. So one of the things that I want to say right out of the gate is that, here's our heart, and from the left ventricle, the blood is pumping out lots of blood. The heart is pumping out lots of blood, and it's traveling in the systemic circuit in these big arteries. And then eventually it branches into arterioles, which are smaller vessels. And then ultimately you'll reach this capillary bed right here, which is made up of the simple squamous endothelium. So this is very thin cells right here, just single cell layers. And what I want to emphasize at this point in the capillary is that this is the point where diffusion of materials take place. In other words, gases will diffuse, water will leave the blood, and so all things that need to be exchanged between the blood and just the cells, like the tissue, are going to always happen at the capillary level, because these are the cells that are thin enough to allow for diffusion and osmosis to take place. Now, the way I've drawn this is that I sort of went from this red to the purple to blue, suggestive of the fact that one of the things that is leaving the bloodstream is oxygen, and that is the case. But there's also lots of other things, like, for example, water. Now, what doesn't leave the circulatory system are larger cells. And so I'll just stay with this color. The larger cells, the red blood cells, are staying within the bloodstream. Now, you may recall white blood cells have the ability to leave the circulatory system. So they're able to travel out of these small passageways between cells in the capillary. And so white blood cells can actually move outside into the tissue fluid over here as well. So white blood cells can leave, but the red blood cells are going to stay in. And it's a closed system because, as you can see here, the blood is then returned to venules and then to vein, and then ultimately in the superior inferior vena cava into the right atrium of the heart. So what I want to say is about this is that the heart's pumping under really strong pressure. So there's a lot of pressure coming out of the heart. And so, what kind of pressure are we talking about? Just on average, you'd have to take your blood pressure, but we're talking about maybe about 120 millimeters of mercury for your systolic pressure. So it's under high pressure. And as a result of the pressure, water is then removed from the capillaries, and it moves into the tissue right here. And so what's interesting about that is, if water kept being sort of squeezed out of the bloodstream, eventually there'd be so much loss of water that your blood pressure would eventually drop, and this wouldn't be a good thing. And so what I want to talk to you about is that we have this system called the lymphatic system. What's interesting about it is that it's a series of capillaries that are very similar to your blood capillaries, but what's different about them is that they come, if you will, on their own. In other words, they're not connected. Oops, excuse me for that. Let's see. They're not connected in a closed circuit. Make sure the battery doesn't run out during the video. The blood is losing water, and these lymphatic capillaries, so this lymph system here, is This is actually a good picture of it. Let's just go with this. And so here's a capillary, and the fluid is being removed. The water is leaving here. Now, water can seep out between the cells of the capillary, but it can also move through osmosis right across the plasma membrane. So white blood cells can leave, but also in the blood, there's larger molecules as well. In the blood, we have lots of plasma. So like all of this is plasma right in here. This is the liquid, which is mainly 90% water. But there's also salts in here, and there's a lot of protein. I'll draw proteins like this. Now there's a bunch of proteins, and they'll range in size. You can have some large ones like immunoglobulins and some small ones like albumins. Okay? So what's actually leaking out of the circulatory system is mainly water, but you also have some proteins that are capable of going out into the tissue fluid. Mostly the small ones, as it turns out. Okay? And so the small proteins are leaking out, the water's leaking out, but the red blood cells are staying inside. And so if I go back to this previous picture over here, and I'll just say that the water's leaking out like this, and the proteins are leaking out. We have these capillaries of the lymphatic system that are going to be picking up the extra water that is leaving the circulatory system. And this water is going to flow in the lymphatic system. Ultimately, it's going to come down like this, and ultimately, it's going to be returned back into the circulatory system just before it enters into the heart. And that's kind of important because it enters into the venous system, and in particular, it enters into the subclavian vein. And the pressure at that point is very, very low. It's quite a change from over here, which is about 120 millimeters of mercury. Here it's only about 5 millimeters of mercury. And so the lymph is what I want to call this. This fluid that is now in these vessels is going to be called lymph. And where did the lymph come from, which is mainly water and some proteins? It came from the plasma of the blood. So it has a very similar makeup of the plasma of the blood, except it's lacking the larger proteins, and it's lacking hormones, etc. And so let's take a look at that. And so fluid from the blood is able to flow out during in the capillary beds and basically leak into the tissue fluid. Now, what these green structures are capillaries of the lymphatic system. And so they're very thin, and they will allow for water and small proteins to move into this lymphatic system. And so the movement of the liquid is in one direction. So it's going into the lymph vessels, these capillaries, and it's going to be moving along and along and along. And ultimately, the point of that, you might be wondering, well, what's the point? The point is to make sure that it's draining the tissue from the excess water that can accumulate because the blood is losing water. And so if we didn't have this lymphatic system, we'd have a lot of swelling in the tissue called edema. And so the lymphatic system is helping to remove the tissue fluid, and it's helping it to ultimately return it back into the blood. And so I mentioned that, but there is another really important function of the lymphatic system too, which is to cleanse the tissue of bacteria. So let's get into that conversation just for a second. So say you had a cut, and there were bacteria that enter, and let me go green for bacteria. Say there's little tiny bacteria that enter, and the bacteria are finding themselves in the tissue of an infected area. Now, you might say, well, if I'm bleeding, maybe there's bacteria in my blood. Well, the truth is there is a little bit of bacteria in the blood, but most infections, the bacteria are in the tissue. We know that because there can be bacterial blood infections, but mostly, like for example, if you have a urinary tract infection, you know that that infection or where the location of the bacteria is localized. Or if you have an infection of like, or inflammation in your finger, it's pretty much, or an infection in the lung, it pretty much stays in the particular area. So it's not that the bacteria are in the blood, but they're rather in the tissue fluid. And so what happens is that in the capillary bed, your white blood cells are macrophages, things like a monocyte or a neutrophil, if you're familiar with these types of leukocytes. They can come out and actually battle these bacteria in the tissue. But what's really cool about this is that when all this fluid is leaving the circulatory system, it drains into the capillaries of the lymphatic system. So it's sort of like sewer. So it's like when it's raining, the water comes from the street and it goes down into the sewer, but it's also bringing this bacteria along with it. And so in the fluid, when it's now in the capillary, it's referred to as lymph. So it's basically the same thing as tissue fluid, lymph is. And so you've got some protein, you've got some water, and now you have some bacteria. And so the point of it is, if you can drain the tissue of bacteria in the lymph system, there's going to be a series of lymph nodes which are going to ultimately filter the lymph and try to destroy as much bacteria as possible. And so when the lymph returns back into the circulatory system, it'll be free of that bacteria. So it's a good way to fight off germs, the lymphatic system. And so, as I mentioned before, once the tissue fluid, which is this fluid right in here between the cells, once it enters into a lymphatic capillary, which is what this is, it's referred to as lymph. So it's mainly water. There are some proteins that will move in there as well, and also some bacteria. And so it's in a unidirectional flow. So the pressure is going in this direction right here. Okay. And so let's back that up just for a second to get some perspective on this. And so here you can see the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So if I trace this with green, let's say that your heart is pumping, here's the aorta, and the blood is coming around like this, big artery, and then arterioles, and then ultimately into a capillary bed. It's here where water is removed from the bloodstream and it moves into the tissue. And it's here where that tissue fluid then enters into the lymphatic capillaries and becomes lymph. You're also, again, clearing the area of bacteria. And so what's going to happen is the lymph is going to move in one direction. Now notice there's, I don't want to be silly about it, but notice there's no heart in the lymphatic system. So the lymph is moving under very low pressure. And so that's something that I want to talk about in a moment. But it's also going in one direction, and these little tiny structures are called lymph nodes. And these lymph nodes are going to be cleansing the lymph and removing the bacteria. And so that's going to be part of our discussion as well. But I wanted to show you that the lymph or lymphatic system is not a closed system. In other words, it sort of has these finger-like capillaries that draw in fluid from the tissues, but then it connects ultimately to the venous system right in this location. And it's not random, it's in the subclavian vein, and this is where the pressure, as I mentioned before, in the blood is very, very low, or else it would be difficult to re-enter that fluid, the lost fluid in all the tissue, back into the circulatory system. And so that's pretty neat, okay? And so let's talk about that. So here's a look at some of the major veins here in the neck. And so this is right where it's entering, which is it drains into the circulatory system right near the vena cava, which is right in the subclavian vein, which is, as you can see here. And so here's the circulatory system. Okay, so here's the pulmonary circuit, and then here's the systemic circuit. Okay, so this represents the entire body. So again, just to recap, capillaries lose a lot of fluids because of the high pressure, and that tissue fluid then travels into lymphatic capillaries where it moves in a single direction. And you might notice, you're like, well, what are these little areas right here? These are valves. These are one-way valves that make sure that the lymph is traveling in one direction. Now, you may recall, if you're familiar with the circulatory system, and also the heart, you may know that there's 4 valves. Here are the AV valves and the semilunar valves. This is the pulmonary semilunar, aortic semilunar. And the valves are one way, making sure that the blood flows in one direction and does not backflow. And so they're very useful. So the lymph vessels also contain very small valves to make sure that the lymph are traveling in one direction. And then this is a little tiny node, a little tiny lymph node, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But when I say it's small, I really do mean it. So this is around 2 to 3 centimeters in size. And so we have a bunch of these. The body has, and there's only 2 of them shown here, but your body has approximately 600 lymph nodes. And so they're spread out all through the body, and they're basically cleansing the lymph of bacteria. They're like little police stations where there's houses white blood cells, and they sort of hijack or take care of the bacteria as it moves from node to node to node. And then ultimately the lymph re-enters the circulatory system, and so to make sure that the tissue isn't swelling. And so as you can see here, there's lymph capillaries. Here are your 2 nodes, and here are some lymph vessels that are entering into the circulatory system here. Okay? Now, the truth is, you're going from the tiniest vessels of all, the lymphatic capillaries, into a little bit larger ones. So you're going from tiny, sort of like the circulatory system, you're going from very thin to something that's a little bit larger, like this. So you're going from tiny capillaries to vessels, and then maybe into a node, and then more vessels, like this, more vessels, and then ultimately you enter in something that's larger even still, called the lymphatic trunk, then into a collecting duct, and then into the subclavian vein. And so what you're seeing here, capillary, let me go back to this other picture in reality. So you're going from capillaries to vessels, and then ultimately to lymph nodes, to more vessels, and then ultimately into a collecting duct right here, which is then entering into the superior vena cava. So that's what this is about. And so I was mentioning inside the lymph vessels, there are these one-way valves, which are kind of neat. So the lymph is traveling like this. Make sure I'm illustrating this. So the lymph is traveling like this, but it's not able to go back. So these are one-way valves. And so that's helpful because there's not a lot of pressure moving the lymph through the lymphatic system. The truth is also we have some smooth muscle that line the lymph vessels that help sort of peristaltically contract the lymph through. But ultimately, what's really moving the lymph more than anything else is not just the smooth muscle, but it's the skeletal muscle. So basically, physical exertion, just moving around, everyday movement, walking and running, exercise is best, because basically what's happening is a person who's physically exercising, their skeletal muscles are pressing along on the lymph, helping to move the lymph along, helping to create that circulation flow a little bit better, and ultimately squeezing it towards the heart. And so along the lymph vessels are these lymph nodes. And so I mentioned this before, is that they sort of filter the lymph, and they do that by attacking viruses and bacteria. And so let's think about this for a second, just anatomically. If you had a lymph vessel like this, and you're entering into a node, okay, which is just like 2 centimeters in diameter, like this. Now, this isn't exactly what the lymph node looks like, but I just want to walk you through it. How would this work? Okay, so the lymph is flowing like this. I'll put some valves in like this, and here's the lymph, and it's traveling this way. Well, the thing is, if this was hollow, the lymph would sort of move as fast as it could across the lymph. And so what you want is the lymph to flow very slowly through this. And so one way to to slow this down is to create these little follicles right here. And so these are sort of like tables in the room. And what has to happen is the lymph has to flow around these. These are known as germinal follicles because what they do is they house a type of white blood cell called a lymphocyte. Okay, and lymphocytes are really powerful. They're very small white blood cells, and what's interesting about them is that there's two kinds of them. There's T cells and B cells. And the B cell in particular does a great job because it's capable of producing these antibodies which circulate proteins in not only the bloodstream but that circulates in the lymph. And these antibodies, or immunoglobulins, are very effective in destroying viruses and bacteria. And so these sort of germinal follicles are where it's like a house of bees. So these are where the B cells are hanging out in here. And so what they do is when there's an infection, so there's some germs, let me make the germs red here. So when some germs are coming in here, there's a bacteria coming in from the lymph. And like, how did it get in there? It drained in. So let me just say, like, more enter and less leave. And you're like, why are less of them leaving? Because as it turns out, these B cells are capable of secreting, they pump up in size. They get really large, the B cells. This is not the whole cell. There's many of these B cells that are in here. Okay, and so these B cells secrete antibodies, and they form the proteins. And when they pump up in size, they're referred to as plasma cells, and they secrete antibodies in here which destroy the bacteria. Now, in these sinuses, there's also, especially in the middle, in the medullary cavity in the center here, there's just simple macrophages, which will destroy any bacteria not specific. The B cells are very specific, and so are the Ts. And there's T cells also that help to destroy cells as well. And so basically, it's like a little police station, and when the germs come in, they're attacked by the white blood cells, and so less are able to leave. And so what you can see here is there's many vessels that are entering into the node. And so just sort of an anatomical term, afferent means a vessel that's allowing something to come in. So there's afferent lymph vessels that are bringing the lymph into the lymph node. And then there's one efferent or exant lymph vessel that comes out, which helps to create sort of higher pressure inside the node. Okay, and so each of these little germinal centers, as I was mentioning before, houses white blood cells, and so this is where all the bacteria are being destroyed. And so the lymph node is really, really important. And so, as you can see in this picture, the lymph nodes are sort of strung along each of the vessels. And so by the time the lymph travels through this node and this node and this node and this node and this node, I mentioned there's hundreds in the body, a lot of the bacteria are eliminated. And so it's great because the tissue fluid is removed and then it's cleansed within the lymphatic system, especially at the lymph node. And so here's an actual picture of a lymph node right here. And so here's the lymph vessel entering into the lymph node, as you can see here. Here's an ordinary blood vessel, and then some muscle, some skeletal muscle right down below here. It's kind of neat. And so what's interesting is, physicians pay attention to these lymph nodes. Like, for example, like if there's some lymph nodes that are underneath your jawbone, submandibular, if there's a few lymph nodes that are right here on top of your parotid salivary gland right here. They're like in little groupings. There's one right here in the back, occipital area. These particular areas where there's clusters of lymph nodes can become swollen, especially if there's an infection in this particular area. I was mentioning that the germs, here are the bacteria, here's a white blood cell. The germs are usually localized, and so the nodes associated with that infection become swollen. It's like the white blood cells are dividing, the cells are becoming enlarged, and they're battling the infection. And so a physician can actually take a look here and actually notice where there's particular lymph nodes that are swollen. These are retro, meaning like going backward, and this is your auricle, this is your ear, so this is retroauricle nodes right here. Probably mispronouncing that. And this is the superficial cervical series of lymph nodes. Now this is pretty extreme, so this is I would say a pretty bad infection. I'm not a physician, but this is pretty severe when you can actually see the nodes penetrating the skin. And so just wanted to point that out. If you've been to the hospital and a physician is feeling around for your swollen lymph nodes, they're looking for the possible infection. So let's talk about this again. This is a little review. So there's these afferent vessels that are bringing in the lymph into the node. These are those germinal centers that I was mentioning before, which are house B lymphocytes. The detail of this, you can keep going further and further, but there's this sort of hard core in the center, primary area where the cells are dividing, and then this outer secondary area is a little bit where there's the cells are secreting antibodies. The fluid is circulating through this medullary area right here where there's a lot of macrophages and T cells. The sinuses, again, are where the lymph is flowing. And this hilum area is the point where there's blood. Now, obviously there needs to be blood coming to the node to supply all these cells with oxygen and nutrients. So that's what this particular area is. The lymph is flowing in an efferent as it leaves. And so basically that's your lymph node right there. And so I also wanted to point out that you might be familiar with, if you've had a chance to study the digestive system, here's a picture of the small intestine. You might recognize the certain layers here. This is the muscular area, the longitudinal and circular. This is the mucosal layer, and then the submucosa. But in the mucosal layer, right here, these are the simple columnar cells which are absorbing in the intestinal villi the food that you're eating. And that goes into the bloodstream, but also there's a lymph vessel right in the center called a lacteal. And the lacteal is important because not only is it draining the intestine for tissue fluid, but it's also a place where fat molecules travel into the lymph. And so lymph is mainly water. It has bacteria in it. There's white blood cells in it. There's some proteins in it. But in particular areas, like for example in the intestine, there's a lot of fat that's in the lymph as well. So the lymph carries fat. When I say fat, what I really want to say is chylomicrons, which are the transportation of triglycerides in the lymph. Okay? And if you were to look at a lymphatic capillary, like for example in the liver, you might find that there's a little bit more protein in the lymph in that particular region. So there's some variation. And so if you're interested in the lymphatic system, there'll be some more videos discussing that along with the immune system. I hope you're intrigued. But this is sort of a backup view of your lymph nodes right up here, and then obviously your spleen is important in terms of your defense, and the thymus gland is where T cells mature. All white blood cells are formed in the bone. Some will stay in the bone and mature, and those are why those cells are called B cells. Okay, and so hopefully you enjoyed this brief introduction on the lymphatic system and how it helps the body drain fluid and aids in defense. Thanks for watching.